Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com, how to make your own carved wood clover St. Patrick's Day decoration. Now this wood clover is very easy to make. I made this one out of a 1x12 piece of pine. You can either paint them or stain them. This one is stained. And they make great decorations for wall hanging or even to be hung on doors as a door hanger. The project starts very simply just to draw the clover onto the piece of wood. This is a 3-leaf clover, and basically each petal is almost like a little heart. And I drew a stem down at the bottom. You could also do a 4-leaf clover in the exact same manner. I'm going to cut out the outline just with a jigsaw. I find it the easiest. You could certainly use a bandsaw or a pin saw, but the jigsaw works really well for this type of project. I do most of my cutting just on a board that's supported by a garbage can, so that each little piece that I cut off just falls right into that can. I'm not the neatest person in the world, but it reduces some of the clutter and some of the small pieces of wood that are on the workshop floor. It really only takes a few minutes to cut out the outline. And on each one of these cuts, you just when you're coming in to corners, meeting up with other cuts, you just don't want to go too far. So just slow down at the very end and just go very carefully, and that way you have less sanding to do also. So that's the finished cutout. Now we're going to add a little bit of character or detail onto that clover. I'm just going to use a disc grinder with a flap sanding wheel. This is a 36 grit, so it's very aggressive. It'll take off a lot of wood very quickly. If you wanted to use something a little bit slower, but certainly safer to use, probably an 80 grit would be the best for this type of work. The 36 is just what I had in the sander, and that's what I used. And all I'm doing is rounding over all of the edges around each leaf, and I'm also going to add some lines so that the leaves seem to continue in towards the center of the stem. And you can also, almost carve a heart shape out of each leaf. You can just duplicate the grooves that I'm making on the video. And I just use this disc grinder to do the rough work. Like I said before, it moves a lot of material very quickly, but you could actually do all of this just with an oscillating sander if you didn't have a disc grinder. So after a few minutes, I've got all of the rough edges rounded over, and I've added whatever grooves that I wanted onto the clover, and this is basically how I finish up with the disc grinder. You can note that there's still a lot of rough edges there, and that's why we do go to an oscillating sander. I started with a 80 grit, and I sanded basically the entire outline of the clover, and I also smoothed out any of the grooves, all of the rough edges from that disc grinder. And this process also doesn't take very long at all. Pine sands very, very quickly. Now before I went to the 220 grit, which is normally what I do, I normally go from 80 to 220 on the oscillating sander. There are some edges, those little corners, etc., that you just can't get at with the sander. So I did do a little bit of sanding by hand with the 80 grit paper, just to get rid of some of those really rough edges. And I find that using your hand, the curvature, it gets those rounded edges a little bit smoother than you can with the flat surface on an oscillating sander. Anyway, when I was done hand sanding, I just went back to the oscillating sander with the 220 grit paper just to make it a little bit smoother before staining. and just going over all of the edges, smoothing out any of the coarse sanding lines from the disc grinder that may still be present, making everything as smooth as possible. When all of the sanding is done, I wanted to stain this clover. I didn't want to paint it. And I didn't have any green stain. I don't even know if they make green stain. So what I did was I took some green paint and I mixed it with a very clear natural stain. Now this is not an oil soluble paint. This is a latex paint. I didn't really know what I was doing here. Didn't really think this was going to mix together very well, but I tried it. And it took a little bit of mixing, but it eventually turned the paint into kind of like a putty, a very thick, mushy mixture. And I experimented with it. I painted it onto the clover. Wasn't really sure whether this was going to soak in the way I wanted it to. I wanted it to be kind of a thin stain that soaked deep into the wood. It kind of went on like paint, completely covered the wood. But this is what I ended up doing and ended up using. So I painted the entire clover with this paint stain combination, and then I wiped off as much as I could with a paper towel. Once I got off the big heavy globs, I then moistened the paper towel in the stain, and I went back over it with the stain and wiped off even more. So I don't know if you could have gotten the same result just with the paint and wiping it off, but the end result came out very nice. This is the finished product, a carved wood clover decoration for St. Patrick's Day. Please check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you.